This is tape 1 of Survivors of the Shoah interview with Pearl Gross, Heinal Weiss. The interview is taking place on November 9th, 1997 in Englewood, New Jersey in the United States of America. The interviewer is David Brodsky and the language of the interview is English. Hi, I'm David Brodsky and today I'm interviewing Pearl Gross, Heinal Weiss. The interview is taking place on November the 9th, 1997 in Englewood, New Jersey in the United States of America. The interviewer is David Brodsky and the language of the interview is English. Can you tell us your name?
My name is Heinal. The present name is Pearl Gross at the moment. I was born Heinal Weiss.
How do you spell that?
Heinal is H-A-J-N-A-L. Weiss is W-E-I-S-Z. It's a Hungarian name.
Did it mean anything?
Yes, Heinal means dawn. Happens to be a very pretty name.
What was your Yiddish or Hebrew name?
My Yiddish name was Perl, P-E-R-L, and that became Pearl in America.
Did you have any nicknames?
Nope.
When were you born?
1935, August 9.
Where?
Debrecen, D-E-B-R-E-N-C-E. And that was a fairly large city in Hungary. I couldn't really tell you where exactly it's located.
How old are you today?
I am 62. Shouldn't ask questions like that.
What was your father's name?
Adolf Weiss. A-D-O-L-F and W-E-I-S-Z.
What do you remember about him?
What do I remember about him? Well, I do remember quite a bit because he passed on in 1981. He was a businessman in Hungary. He was an modern Orthodox man. He was fairly well educated, though he came from a small town. As I said, he was a businessman until the Hungarians took away his permit to be in legal business. He was in a trucking business. And then he had to resort to sort of black marketing, which was quite rampant in those days by Jews.
What type of work did he do with the trucking?
Well, he was really just a businessman. He didn't drive trucks himself. And
did you ever go with him?
Oh my gosh, no, that was before my time. I was the youngest of the 7 children, and this trucking business really was from in the 1920s on to the late 1930s, so I wouldn't remember.
What type of a person was he?
My father. He was a religious man, but he had very modern ideas. He liked to have a good time. He was a very good father, concerned with his children. He liked to travel. He was a very interesting man.
How was he raised religiously?
He was raised very religious, but not Hasidish. With that I mean there was no gartel, there was no stremel, that kind of a thing. My grandfather did have a beard. My father did not have a beard. He was the oldest of his siblings, and usually the oldest is the most religious, but in his case, he was sort of a bit of a black sheep.
What type of a Hasidic background?
He was not a Hasidic background, but his father was a Belzer Hasid. I gather my great-grandparents did come from Poland, and I guess they had some kind of association with the old Belzer rabbi. So the only thing that I do know is that my grandfather and my father used to go every year to Belz, Poland, for the high holidays. And that remained with him till the end of the life. His end, life, he was supporting the Belzer organization. And we do it to this day, my siblings and myself.
What was your mother's name?
Her name was Maria, for a Jewish name, but she was Maria, M-A-R-I-A, Hornstein, H-O-R-N-S-T-E-I-N. She comes from Hajdunanash. It's a small town near Debrecen where I was born. She was brought up in a fairly wealthy house. My grandfather used to import Panama hats from Panama. Um, Again, very Orthodox, but not Hasidims. But my grandfather passed away in the 20s, and then it was sort of downhill for them because her siblings were young and the business sort of went under.
What was your grandparents' names?
My grandfather's name was Joseph Hornstein, and my grandmother's, I can't remember her name.
Do you remember?
My grandfather, of course not, because he died before my mother got married. My grandmother, yes, I remember her. In fact, she was in Budapest in 1943, and then in 1944 she was deported, and she never came back.
Your other grandparents?
I remember my grandfather. He was also deported. My other grandmother passed away in 1943. Her, I don't recall that much.
What were their names?
My grandfather's name was Asher Zelig Weiss from Yerbator, where my father was born, I think. My grandmother's name I can't recall.
How many siblings did you have?
I had 6 siblings. I had, my oldest brother was born in 1922. His name was Joseph. He never came back from Auschwitz. Then I had twins, sisters and brothers, Myron and Valerie, who are living here in New York. I had another brother whose name is Theodore. He's also in New York. And I have a sister whose name is Eboy, and she lives in Miami Beach. My brother, the youngest next to me, was in Auschwitz, came to America in 1945, but he was killed in a car automobile accident in 1953. His name was Julius, actually, in English.
Were you close with your siblings?
Was I close? Well, not really, because there were tremendous age difference. Between myself and my oldest were 13 years and went down the line. The closest was a 5-year difference, and because of the war, we were separated a lot. So our closeness really started after the war in America.
What type of a religious upbringing did you have in the house?
Strictly Orthodox, Shabbat, keeping the Sabbath and kosher, but modern. What do I mean by modern? Interesting. Well, modern means is the way I look right now. I wore pants in the olden days. My mother wore shadels, but none of my sisters are wearing shadels. My parents went to theaters, went to movie theaters, went to cafes. So it was a modern life, but it was an Orthodox life.
Do you remember what Shabbos was like?
In the olden days, it's like we have it today in my house. It's before Shabbos, everybody gets dressed, and the man goes to shul. I light candles, and they come home, and we sing around the table, Shalom Aleichem, and the Kiddush, and so forth. It's a very nice experience, but that's exactly the way it was in my house. We're not any different today than we were 50 years ago, which is very unusual, because we were 6 people surviving the Holocaust, and when you have 6 children surviving, you'll have some becoming more religious, others becoming not religious at all. We stayed the same plateau, all of us, the same way. We did not change at all.
Did you have any different foods?
In Hungary, of course, Hungarian goulash and so forth. Yes, it was a richer food. It's more fatty. Today we are very concerned with health, diet, so of course we don't do those things. But believe it or not, though I left Hungary when I was a really young girl, a lot of my cookings are still Hungarian. I guess you're a product of your upbringing.
How about on Shabbat? Any different foods?
No, the cholent, the gefilte fish, the challah, no, very much the same.
Do you remember any of the holidays growing up before the war?
You're going to laugh what I remember. Yom Kippur, everybody going to shul, fasting, and I go with my little bag with delicious cakes because I was very young and I didn't have to fast. This is what I remember. I remember Purim in my grandfather's house where the young children used to say Purim spiel. I don't know if you know that. They used to go from houses to houses. They said something funny and they used to get money for that. I remember going to my grandfather's house, my father's on Shabbos, and I used to wear short sleeve dresses and he used to throw the towel at me so I should cover my arms. It's interesting what stays in your mind.
Did you go to shul much?
As a little girl, I don't remember it. No. My parents went to shul, of course. Shabbos, Yom Tov, and so forth.
How big was your town about?
The town that I was brought up till the age of 7, I think they had about 15,000 Jews. But after that, we moved to Budapest, which was a city.
Do you remember your address in Budapest?
Yes, Garai Utca, that is the street 35.
What type of schooling did you have?
I had 1 grade in Budapest. After we were liberated, we went to Germany to be able to come to the United States because there were no immigration from Hungary because of the Russian occupation. There I went to, frankly, I didn't even go to school in Germany, but from Germany we went to France because the immigration didn't go through. There I did go for 1 year. From France we went back to Germany again. I was in a trade school which was sponsored by the ORT organization. I learned how to sew, and then from there we came to the States and I went to school in the States. And in the States I went to junior high, high school, and college.
What do you remember about Budapest?
I had very good memories about Budapest. We moved up there in 1942, so I was about a 7-year-old, going on 7 years old. Our lives were much better than in the small town. It was a nice life. Friends, going to theaters, going to movies, going to the swimming pools. It was a nice life. My father made a very comfortable living in Budapest before the war. Of course, with the war there was disruptions. After the war, it was again pretty nice, but we knew we had to leave because the Jews wanted to leave. It was an anti-Semitic country and we didn't want to stay on. And I had family in the United States, aunts, uncles, cousins, and so forth.
Did you experience any anti-Semitism before the war or during?
The only anti-Semitism that I remember as a child is when we moved up from Nyírbátor to Budapest. We had to have legal authorization, but we could only go at night. And I remember being on the train at night and the police coming on the train. In Hungary they had these high hats with the feathers on. It was very frightening for a little girl. And I remember we were hovering in the corner that they shouldn't come over to us and they should leave us alone. That's the only thing I remember being a Jew and being, afraid of it.
What was life like in Nyírbátor compared to Budapest?
I don't remember much of Nyírbátor. In fact, I hardly remember anything about Nyírbátor.
What do you remember? Did you have electricity?
Yes, in my days we had, okay, I do remember something. I had electricity, but we didn't have Frigidairs. I remember ice box, like a box, and the men used to come around and bring ice, to put in their blocks of ice. I remember an outhouse in one of the buildings. We did not have automatic bathrooms. There was an outhouse further away from the house. I remember not having mattresses. We had straw bags, which was every year we got a clean one before Pesach. It's interesting you bring this up.
Are there any smells or colors you remember from that age, from before Budapest?
No, I really don't.
Why did your parents move to Budapest?
because my father couldn't make a living there anymore. And of course, Budapest being a big city, there was no more opportunity. And I think the last year that we lived in Nyírbátor, he was going a lot to Budapest. So he decided that in a big city, though there was anti-Semitism, but you still had more of a freedom to do things business-wise. So he decided to move us up, and that's what really saved our life. Otherwise, we would have been deported to Auschwitz.
What type of work was he doing in Budapest?
Something with textile, and I couldn't go into buying and selling textile. It had also some black marketing in it, but it had to do with textile.
Was the food situation any different from Nyírbátor to?
I don't remember any problem with the food situation in Nyírbátor, and in Budapest we were fine.
Did you have any non-Jewish friends?
No. I went to Jewish school there, and my friends were all Jews.
Did you hear anything about a war going on when you were little?
I recall something. Now, if this happened in Nyírbátor or Budapest, I couldn't tell you, but I do recall evening sitting at the table, somebody who was just coming from Poland was telling horror stories about Jews being deported. And I remember that very distinctly, but really I don't know if it was in Budapest or Nyírbátor. The Jews should try to save themselves.
How did your parents react to that?
I don't remember. I guess everybody was awed by it and listening. If it was in Nyírbátor, I would think that had a lot to do with the fact that we moved to Budapest, that my father was convinced we had to get out of small towns because they stifle you, suffocate you, and you don't have much of a chance to move.
Do you remember Pesach? Any Pesach?
I remember Pesach in Budapest, but as I said, it wasn't any different than the way we had Pesach in New York or even in my house. So it didn't leave any special or different impression on me. It's the same thing.
Do you remember the first time you heard about the Germans?
I think the first time I heard about, besides what I just told you about that evening, is when they came to Budapest. And it was a Sunday afternoon. It's almost like what it was today. It was dreary, rainy, and in the radio it said that the Germans are marching in. It was a horrible, even as a little girl, I knew something was happening, something terrible. And it was very frightening. I remember that.
Do you remember anything else about that day?
It was just terrible. It was like everybody was devastated. It was like somebody dies. It was a terrible day that I remember.
Remember when you first saw a German soldier?
I think the following day. But I don't recall. I don't know.
Did you go out on the streets much in that time?
Yeah, we went out on the street until the law came in about the yellow stars. That you had to wear yellow stars and you had certain times to be out. But before that, yeah, we did go out.
What year was that?
1944.
Do you remember how things started changing right away when the Germans came?
Bombing. A lot of bombing. Right away. Budapest was bombed. Of course, we had to have black, something on the windows, something black, I guess, curtains, whatever. And every night we had prepared candles because you couldn't have the electric lights burning, and ready to go down to the cellar. And we were all prepared with clothing next to our beds. And then the sirens went off, and then we were running into the basement.
Were your parents trying to explain the situation in any way to you that you remember?
Not to me, no. I was a child, and my parents were a bit old-fashioned. They didn't explain things to children. We just went along. It just happened.
Your other siblings?
Well, my other sibling, that was, okay, let me backtrack. The only siblings that lived with us in Budapest were my two sisters and two brothers.
What are their names?
My sister Valerie, who was the oldest, there was 13 years age difference. There was my sister Eboy. There was 9-year age difference between myself and her. Then there was my brother. They didn't even live with us because when we moved up to Budapest, apartments were not readily available. It was very difficult to get apartments. So my father was able to get a one-bedroom that was converted to a sort of a dining room. We used it for both, and then a kitchen. So we didn't have the space. So two of my brothers were sort of renting an apartment, sort of a room, a couple of houses down the street.
What were their names?
Joseph and Myron. My brother, I had two other brothers, and they stayed on in Yerbator because they were still going to yeshivas. So the yeshivas were not the same in the small town, or the big city as the small town, so they stayed on with the grandparents.
Do you remember how if anything else changed after the bombing started?
Well, it's changed rapidly, what happened. Then we started to hear that from small town people are being taken away to work camp like. But in Hungary, there was a small town, and I can't recall the name, where my grandparents, all my aunts and uncles were taken. Yes, I do remember. Shima Pusta was the name. We used to get cards from them. We used to send food to them.
To who?
To my grandfather.
Which one?
From my father's side. And my brother, my youngest brother, was also taken there. Then it was bad. It was just, we lived from day to day what's happening to any part of the family, each individual. Then my father was taken to work, not a camp, it was supposedly a soldier. My brother was taken away.
What was this about?
When? Late 44, like September. One of my brother was taken to Romania.
Which one?
I can't, Tibby, I really can't remember the sequences, okay? It's just I know where they were.
What else do you recall of that time?
What else do I recall? Well, then after a while, we had a friend of ours, a Christian young man, who decided that he's going to help us to find out what's happening to the family, the one who were deported to Shima Pusta, stayed in Hungary in a working city. And he went down there with food to see my father's family. He did take food, as I said, and he came back and he said, they're okay. They didn't treat them very badly. They were working. Actually, it was like a waiting period for them before they were taken to Auschwitz. And then he came back. I'm really telling you things like haphazardly.
What was his name, if you recall?
I have no idea. Then my father, I'm going to backtrack. I told you my father and my grandfather were Belzer Hasidims. And they were very concerned what happened to the Belzer rabbi. And my father was able to employ a man and a woman with Christian papers to go to Poland to try to get the Belzer Rebbe out. For whatever reason, the wife could not come, but they did bring the Belzer Rebbe to Budapest. Now, he was in Budapest before he went to Israel in 1944, and I remember seeing the old rabbi. So that was one of his greatest accomplishments, to save the old Belzer Rebbe.
Do you remember seeing him?
Oh yes, I remember seeing him.
What did he look like?
It was very interesting, and I'll never forget it. He was sitting in a room. I really didn't see his face because he was sitting behind a desk. His head was like this down, and on two sides there were two burled bags full of money. people came to give money and to help Jewish people, whichever way they can, to buy Christian paper. And he blessed us. And my father was talking to him in Yiddish. I did not know Yiddish, so I didn't understand. And I remember there were thousands of people. Now in Europe, the buildings were like courtyards. And I remember standing in the court, on the what would you call it? Not in the courtyard downstairs, but upstairs, like a balcony, surrounded the, it was practically shaking from people. Fragments memory.
You remember his name?
No. My siblings would know it. No, I don't remember. And then they were able to get him to Palestine in 1944. And my father went to see him after the war.
Did you ever see him?
Again? No.
What else do you remember?
About?
Budapest.
Budapest. Well, all right, if you want to hear about the war, I remember that in late 1944, Szálasi came into the government. I don't know if you're familiar with that name. He was a Hungarian Nazi, the worst kind. I remember that when we heard it, everybody was practically tearing their hair out. I remember the crying. And we had to save ourselves, and how naive we were. Where I lived, when you go into the building itself, you go into a courtyard, and our apartment was the first to the right, and all the windows were facing the street. So we're sort of subjected to the Germans. If they would come in, we would be the first they would take away. So we were so naive that everybody who were facing that frontage moved to the back of the building, and we put chairs against the knob of the doors so they're not going to come in. It's unbelievable when you think about that, because we thought that they're going to come right away and they're going to take us all away, and this is going to hold them back. Anyways, after that, the only thing I can remember that my sister got Christian papers.
Which one?
Both. Both of them. Both Valerie and E-boy got Christian papers. My parents got Christian papers. I was not able to get. But they somehow got hooked up with some Swiss people. I really don't know how they did, but my parents were able to go out of this house and go to a Swiss, a house that was protected by the Swiss government. They took me with them. My sisters had Christian papers, so what they did, I have a sister who's a redhead. She right away dyed her hair to black, because it was some kind of fallacy. If you had redhead, you had to be Jews. So she didn't want to be seen as a redhead, and I always wore a little cap, so they shouldn't see my red hair. And they got they rented a room, and they were there holding up. So I was with my parents for a very short period of time, until my sisters found out that there is a cheese factory where there's a a Jewish man who was married to a Christian woman, who had some kind of a connection to the Swedish and the Swiss government. And they decided to, of course, I don't know who gave them money, to bring children into that place and try to protect the children from the Germans. They did succeed, of course, and later on we found out this had to do with the Wallenberg protection organization.
At the end of tape one. This is a Shoah tape 2, interview with Pearl Gross.
Well, as I said before, my sisters found out about this sort of safe haven. And they found out that children are being protected there.
Did you have any papers at this point? Or?
I had no papers.
And who was together with you at this point?
My two sisters, Valerie and E-boy. Now,
and your parents?
My parents were in that Swiss safe house.
father and
be
your
there,
mother.
my mother and my father. I couldn't be there. Children could not be there. So in this particular safe house where I just mentioned, you had to be 16 and under. Now, I was under 16, and so was my sister Iboy, but my other older sister was not. So she went there to try to enter herself, and my other sister. They took my sister, my middle sister, but they didn't want to take her unless she will work as a worker, which of course she was gladly to do. Then she came to my parents and picked me up and took me there. Now, we were there approximately, what I can recall, about 3 months, because this was sort of October and November. The war ended in January, 3 months, something like that. I don't recall much what went on there. What I do recall that after about a month or so, or 6 weeks, the Germans decided that this is a Jewish hideout place, and they came to take everybody away. Everybody over, no, everybody, children, everybody, okay? And they told them to get dressed, and we're taking you to Germany. You're going to march, so everybody get dressed. My sister at the time was about 19. Somehow, I don't know, a flare went off in her head. No, I'm not going to do this. And she went, and she took me and my sister to a room and threw us out of the window. And she told us to just walk away. Now, I have to backtrack because this is not my recollection of what happened, which I happen to find out today. My recollection of this particular situation was that my sister got hold of myself.
Which sister?
My oldest sister, Valerie, got hold of myself and my middle sister, and we just walked out of the building. My older sister tells me today that was not so, so here I'm a bit confused. So what happened to myself and my middle sister, we were thrown out of the window, and my oldest sister Valerie told us to go to my parents' building. This was the building that was protected by the Swiss government. And what she did, she was not a child anymore, she walked out of the building. Now the Germans stopped her. It wasn't Germans, it was Hungarian SS. They stopped her. And she said, I have Christian paper, which she did have. And they said they're going to check with the organization inside. And while they went to check, my sister snuck out of the place and came to my parents' place, and she found us there. Now, we were there for a few days, and then it's interesting how brave young girls were in those days. They left the building and they decided to go back to this particular cheese factory to see what's going on.
Who?
My two sisters, my two oldest sisters, because my parents were very afraid for them to be there. Children were not supposed to be. Believe it or not, some people would muster you. First of all, you took space up, and they wanted older people and their own people there. They didn't want us to be there. Everybody was out to save themselves. So my two oldest sisters went to this cheese factory where we were hiding originally, and they saw there were children there. So what happened, the children that were taken away, they were taken to the Danube. They were all killed, every single one of them. But the head of the organization, which had to do with the Zionism, decided to reopen this place. I don't know how it was, how they maneuvered it, and they started to bring any babies or any young children they could get hold of and take it there again. So when my sister saw this is in existence, came back, took me away from my parents, and we went back. And actually we stayed there till the very end of the war. How we were liberated, again, I found out today, very interesting. My sister tells me that this particular factory had a basement, and we were kept in the basement because in those days the shooting were going from building to building. One building was German and the next building were Russian, and it was like shooting each other. So we were afraid to be upstairs because the bullets were flying. So they were continuous shooting there. So that's why we were in the basement. And then one day they heard they were quiet, and then they heard loud noises, so they sort of tried to, I don't know, went up the steps, and they heard a strange language. My sister spoke German, so she knew it wasn't German. So of course they came to the conclusion it was Russian. And they were very happy. They were, you know, jubilant. And they wanted to call out to them. These are young girls. We're talking about 16, 17, 18, 19-year-old girls, where the head of the organization, their man, said, do not show yourself to the soldiers because they are out to rape women. They took the girls downstairs and they made them go to bed, and they made us little ones lie on top of them. So they shouldn't see they were young girls. The Russians eventually did come down to the basement. They were drunk and they were terrible. I mean, the scum of earth. And they wanted to, they were looking for barishnya. Barishnya in Russian means women. They wanted to rape them. There was a young man who talked them into that he was a woman, and he allowed them to rape him. So they were satisfied, and then they left. It wasn't a pretty picture. And then we were liberated. The first thing we did is we go to my parents.
When was this?
This was in January, okay? I can tell you another thing, as far as my parents, they did not have a free ride in that Swiss house either. The Germans did come to take them to the Danube River. At the time, for whatever reason, I don't remember, my father wasn't there, but my mother was. And when they entered the building, they made them line up in front of the building, and they should start marching to the river. They knew they were going to be shot. My mother, she was a 46-year-old woman at the time, wasn't very worldly, but smart woman. As they were marching, she just stepped out of the line. There was a cafe house, and she went to the cafe house, and she sat down, and she ordered a cafe. And she sat there for hours. They heard the shooting, because that was near the Danube. I don't know that night what she did, but I do know the following day she did go back to the same house. She walked by. She didn't see any Germans, and she's going to the building, and there were some people, and she went back there. Now my father, I don't know where he was at the time, but he wasn't privy to this, and when he came back, he went straight to the building, and my mother was there, so she was alive. But I would say 90% of those people who were there were killed.
How was the food situation before you were liberated?
I am a poppy seed addict today. And do you know how interesting that is? I told you that my sisters took me to my parents for 2 days. There was no food. There was poppy seed and there was jam. And that's what I ate. A little bit of poppy seed for a few days and a little bit of jam. And I became an addict. The food was very bad. Very bad. We had crumbs, but we had water. It was secondary.
Was there bombing going on also?
Continuously. There was bombing. I remember one instance, again in sequence, I have no idea when, that I was walking on the street with my older sister, Valerie, and the sirens went off. And we were passing by a house, a building where Germans were standing outside with a gun on their shoulder. And my sister was frightened. We didn't know what to do because you're not supposed to walk the streets when the siren goes off. And the Germans didn't imagine that we would be Jews and said to us, come over here, come to us, and stand at least in the doorway. Don't walk the streets. And we did. Of course, shaking in our boots, but we did. And then when the sirens went off again, we left. Continuous bombing at night. I remember, for instance, when we still lived in Gorajutsa, before we left that house going into the Swiss Haven houses, when we went down to the basement and there was no lights and my mother was holding on to some whatever hands she could, the children, and kept on calling the names down from the oldest to the youngest, are you with her? It was frightening, I have to say.
Were there any roundups on the streets when you were walking the streets sometimes?
I didn't see any. I didn't see any. I was a little girl and I was sheltered by my parents. I'm sure my sisters did see it.
Are there any other recollections you have from before liberation in Budapest? Any colors or sounds or smells?
No, just a lot of cryings. Bombs. Listening to the radio. We had a radio hidden, and we're able to listen to London. And we're listening to the radio at night under the pillow. I remember that.
Did many people have radios?
No, the reason we had is because the person who took care of this apartment building was a wonderful Christian couple, and we were very close with them before the war, and we remained close. And they smuggled a radio to us, and they helped us. Yeah, but no, there were not a lot of radios.
How did people get along?
You mean other than the family itself? I think they got along. I think they were there to help each other. We were all in the same boat. Again, I was 7 years old.
Did people ever fight over food?
No, I don't ever remember that. No. I do remember that when I was in the children's safe house, we had food, but my sisters and I, we never ate non-kosher food. I do remember that. Though there was some meat, but we never ate non-kosher. My parents never ate non-kosher food.
Were you able to celebrate the Shabbat at all?
I couldn't tell you. You mean when I was in the safe house? I don't remember. It wasn't a religious atmosphere.
Is there anything else you recall about Budapest?
Not much more. I think that's all I can.
How did Budapest look
After the war,
liberation?
terrible. Budapest was a beautiful city architecturally, and it was a beautiful city after the war. I mean, the holes in the building, it was devastating. Rubbles. It was very bad. After the war, we went back to our old apartment. Of course, it was a mess and so forth. There was no food. It was in January, middle of the winter. So my father decided that the best thing would be for us to move back to a small town where my parents came from, near Bator, because a small town probably had farming and so forth. There would be food, and we did go back to Budapest, to near Bator from Budapest in January, and we stayed there till June for 6 months.
Who were you together with at that
I was
point?
with my two sisters, Valerie, Eboy, my parents, and Myron. That's about it. My brother, Joseph, was deported to Auschwitz. He never came back. My brother, Tibor, was in the army, was taken to Romania, and he was there till the spring of 45. And my youngest brother was taken to Auschwitz, and he survived. I'll tell you this, though, how he survived. And I think I saw something like this in Schindler's List. He was in Auschwitz. He was 14 years old. He was born in 1930, so it was in 1944. And when they came to take them to either the gas chamber or the labor camp, he saw, I don't know how he did it, he saw an outhouse, and he ran to it. And he was holding out there. He was afraid. He didn't know what to do. Then he heard some SS coming, and he jumped into the hole, the toilet itself. He was covered up to here. And they came in, and of course after that they went out. Then he came out of there, but I can't recollect how he managed to get rid of everything. But he did survive in a work camp. He came back in 1945, June, to Budapest. Then my brother, it's sort of tragic, that's what I'm sort of putting into it. My brother and E-boy decided to go to Germany, to immigrate to the United States of America in 1945. They had false papers as twins, and in end of 1945 did come to the United States. So he was at the time 15 years old, 1930, 15 years old. Of course, the Jewish organization, I don't know if it was a joint or one of them, put him into school. He went to school, high school, Yeshiva University, and in 1953 he was killed in a car accident.
What was his name?
Sorry. His name was Julius Weiss. Very bright young man. And then we found out my oldest brother actually survived the war, but died out of, malaria. Was it malaria? Some very bad disease after the war. So I lost two brothers. I lost all my grandparents, most of my aunts, uncles, most of my cousins. We were practically wiped out. And we're in the United States of America, and thank God this country has been pretty good to us. We're able to start new here. My parents had a hard time, of course, to acclimate themselves. They didn't know the language. And my father was not a very healthy man. But we go on.
How long did you stay in near Bator?
When, after the war, 6 months.
What was what was it like?
In Yerbator, it was happy and it was sad, because those people who were liberated, most of them did want to come back and see who in their family survived. So they were trickling in. Every day somebody else got off the train, and everybody who was in the town already went to the train station, who's going to come back. My father was not very lucky, only one of his brothers was able to come back from the war, from Auschwitz. So again, it was a very interesting time, because there was a lot of happiness, survival, a lot of sadness. But people did not stay on. I think they stayed on for just a couple of years, and then they left near Bator. They tried to go to Germany, because the Hungarian Jews did not have very good quota for United States. And those who did not want to go to Palestine, it wasn't very easy to go to Palestine, they came to Germany, and they were living in a displaced camp, which we call DP camps. And actually that's exactly what we did, my family. In June we went to Budapest, 1945 June, and we stayed on till 1947. It wasn't easy to leave Budapest because of the Russians. You couldn't leave the country. Again, my father had to organize illegally to leave the country at night in 1947, June.
Do you remember that?
Oh yes, I remember that. I remember that very well. We left Budapest in a car, and it's not a fuel car. It had a wood-burning chimney in the back. And at night, we went to Prague. But from Prague, the men who took us to Prague would not go to Germany, because you had to cross from the Russian to the American zone. And that was organized to walk at night, the border. And I remember very well the walk. It was not very pleasant. It was in the fall, and I think we started out at 1 o'clock in the morning, and myself, one of my sister, Valerie, the oldest, My mother, my father, and some other people who belonged to this particular group, we had to pay for that. It was all done black, of course. And it took us 2 hours to walk at night the border to Germany. I don't remember the town we came to. But this was a receiving camp, a displaced camp by the Americans. People were coming all the time. We were there for, I think, a couple of days, and then the Joint took us to everybody was taken to different camps. We were taken to Schwäbisch Hall. That's a displaced camp. This particular section in Schwäbisch Hall really was a resort for the Germans. And now the Joint took it over and the Jews were there. And there you had many nationalities, Hungarians, Polish, Romanian, whatever, whoever's Czechoslovakian. And there we were given food, and people tried to work somehow, get busy in organizations or helping out with the Joint, just to do things. Nobody liked to sit around. Of course, the women and the children, well, you know. They did have some schooling for the children just to keep them busy. They did have what they call it Fachschule, which was a trade school, to teach some of the youngsters to do some kind of a trade thing. Now, we were there for 1947 to 1948. We couldn't get any visas to the United States. And the story was that if you go to France, it's easier for the Hungarians to go to the United States. So again, my father, who was very resourceful, I have to say, managed to get some kind of a paper to leave Germany to go to France. So we went to Paris. My family lived in Paris for a year. I was put into a children's home. Actually, mostly orphans were there through connections, so I should have some kind of an education and I should learn the language. So I lived in a beautiful castle in Versailles. It was nice. I lived in Versailles for close to a year. I learned the language, but my parents were not very successful getting visas to the United States. So again, he worked through connections that we should go back to Germany. So here we go, pack up again, and we went back to Germany. This time we went to Fürth. Fürth is a small town next to Nuremberg. We lived there not even a year, and there we were succeeded to get visas to the United States. So from Fürth we were taken to Bremerhaven, and we boarded, that was a very festive day, we boarded a boat called the United States Taylor or something like that, U.S. Taylor, and then we came to the United States of America.
When?
November 1949, but by that time I had three brothers here and one sister. They did it earlier in different ways.
Did your parents think of going to Israel at all?
No. My mother had here 2 sisters and one brother, so she really wanted to unite herself with the family. So my mother's sister, one sister came in the 30s, early 30s. Another sister came in the late 30s. So they already had, their feet on the ground. So she really wanted to come to the United States.
What were their names?
I had an aunt whose married name was Österreicher. I had another aunt whose married name was Weiss. Then I had an uncle whose name was Hornstein.
What were their first names?
My uncle's name was Chaim Hornstein. My aunt's name was Hanukkah. And I had another aunt, Wieder, Elaine Wieder, who lived in Borough Park. So we had some family here and cousins.
What was life like here in America?
How is life here like as far as aesthetically or as far as, okay, aesthetically coming to New York, to the biggest disappointment of my brother was not such a big thing. We came from Paris. city of the world. So, you know, Paris was a magnificent city, so aesthetically, New York was no big deal. Life, on the other hand, was very difficult for my parents, extremely difficult, not knowing the language, not knowing how to make a living. For me as a little girl, finally, I was 14 years old and I really had no schooling, so it was very difficult, and I did not know the language. So it was very difficult in the beginning. I was placed into a junior high school in Brooklyn, only for 1 year, not even, just about 1 year. And then they put me into Beis Yaakov in Williamsburg for 1 year, but really that wasn't for me. But by that time I was able to, little girls adopt themselves quite well, adapt myself to the language, and then from then on I was okay. My parents had difficult years, very difficult years.
What did they do?
Well, in the beginning, I think they had help from the joint organization. And then my father got involved with the Morning Journal. It was a Jewish paper through connection to travel and to sell. And he did that for quite a while. And of course, we went out to work, my sisters, ourselves, and we helped financing, the house expense and so forth. We all had to help.
Did any of your father's relatives survive?
My father had one brother out of 7 siblings who survived, but he went to Israel. And he had his children, his wife did not survive. He had 6 children, they did not survive. He went to Israel by himself, and then he got married a second time. He never had any more children. All his other brothers and sisters were killed. Cousins, nephews and nieces, he only had 1 niece surviving from, I can tell you, dozens who also went to Israel.
What were their names?
My uncle's name was Shia Weiss and lived in Bnei Barak, died in the 80s. And my cousin's name was Tova Weiss, but then she got married. And Tova Horowitz, she's still there. She's in Israel. She lives in Haifa. So my father's family was totally wiped out.
What did you do here in the United States?
What did I do? I went to high school.
Where?
While I went to, again, I went for 1 year to Beis Yaakov, and then I went to New York High School. It was not a Jewish school, it was a city school. I worked part-time at Barton's candy store. I babysitted. Summertime, I worked very hard as a young girl. I was 15 years old, and I worked in a candy store. And it wasn't just giving sodas. I worked very hard. I was washing floors. I was lifting cases of milk. I was working for $35 a week. And out of that $25 I gave to my parents, $10 I kept to myself. I started to support myself at the age of 15. And when I graduated high school, as much as I wanted to go to college, I couldn't afford it. I went to work as a bookkeeper, but I did go to night school in Brooklyn College. As long as I was a single person, I always helped my parents. I lived at home and I gave money home. But I had a good life. I can't complain. I made good money. I traveled. It was fine. And then I met my husband. I went out on dates like young girls, and then I met my husband.
We're at the end of tape 2. The Shoah interview with Pearl Gross. So tell me about meeting your husband.
About meeting my husband, that's a very interesting story, because as a young girl I was going on dates, and of course, like any parents, they wanted to get married as soon as possibly they can get rid of me. I wasn't a very easy person to marry off, but...
Why do you say that?
Because I was the black sheep of the family. Why? Well, I am a European girl. I didn't want to go out with European guys. I was very Americanized. And my father was a very European man, and he didn't like the idea. And again, being European, they looked for the family background. It was very important to my family. I did not care about family background. I was a young girl. I wanted to fall in love, and so, et cetera, et cetera. So there was a problem. And of course, friends wanted to fix me up, and I resented that. I wanted to go on my own. My husband is an interesting situation because my mother was a wonderful woman. I could never say no to her. And she told me she would like me to go out with this young man. And I said, oh, Mother, please. So she asked me, please do me a favor. I couldn't say no to her. I said, fine, another Sunday afternoon. Well, you know, one of those dates. And that turned out to be my husband. How did that come about? My husband's family happened to be very good friends of my parents going back to the old country. In fact, my husband and my brother knew each other in Yerbator. My husband stayed with his grandparents in Yerbator, who was the rabbi of that particular town, and we lived there. And my father met this young man and liked him. He was a very good-looking young man, and said to his friend, the rabbi who my husband was visiting, who was his uncle, how about getting your nephew with my black sheep daughter together? So my husband and I met, and it just clicked. It was just one of those things, and my parents were happy forever. There was the background. My husband comes from a very respected and well-known background, and this was very important for my parents. And my husband was a very Americanized person. So we clicked. What can I tell you?
What's his name?
Jack Rose.
Which brother knew him?
Tibby. And Tibby is the person who also, by the way, did this for the Spielberg organization, so there should be filed. In fact, they went to yeshiva in Yerbator together, my brother and my husband.
And when did you get married?
We got married in 1961 in New York.
And then what happened?
Well, he whisked me to Montreal. I lived in Montreal because he lived in Montreal. We lived in Montreal for 9 years. I gave birth to 3 boys. It was nice time. We had a very nice time there, but since my family lived in New York and my parents, we came to the States to live, and we've been here ever since then.
What are your sons' names?
My son's name is Michael, who was born in 1962. 1963 I had Ronald, and 1969 I had Robert.
How was it in Montreal? Was it tough not knowing French? Or?
Well, in those days you didn't have to know French, but my husband happens to be not even bilingual. He knows quite a few languages, so he knew French. But I did not miss the French language at all in Montreal. It was more Anglo-Saxon. Today it's very Frenchy, but in those days there's no problem. But we also came here. We came here in 1970, and there was political problems in Montreal at the time, the separatists and so forth. They wanted to become a French country, and my husband felt that he doesn't want his children to be brought up in that atmosphere. He wanted them to be anglicized and to come to the States. So we made the move. And it was a pretty good move. I can't complain.
And where did you move to here?
We moved to Kew Garden in Queens. We lived there for 5 years. My husband was in construction business in Montreal. And when we came to New York, he had to start all over again. It was quite difficult. But he was able to establish a business in Pennsylvania. So for 4 years, he commuted from Pennsylvania to New York. And then after that, we've had it. You know, it wasn't a normal life. We moved to Allentown, Pennsylvania. We lived there for 21 years. My husband is in business to this day there. 4 years ago, we decided to move to New Jersey. Since my children went to school in New York and lived in New York, I wanted to come back to New York. My whole family's here. Ironically, one of my sons moved back to Allentown, Pennsylvania now. He lives there because he's in business with my husband. So we're sort of commuting a bit now too. The business is still in existence in Pennsylvania.
Did you ever go back to your town?
To Budapest? Yes, I went back in 1975. It was very interesting because I left it as a child. I went back as an adult. There were things that I didn't remember, and there were things that was so big in my eyes as a child, shrunk to this much. Went back to the building that I lived in. It was devastating to see what it looked like because it was still had holes in it from the war, and of course the 1956 uprising. Wasn't a very pleasant trip. We went to all the cemeteries. My husband went back to Satmar, to the graves of his father, who was buried there in the 30s, and I went back to the graves of my grandparents. I went back again in the early 80s with my sister alone. It was sort of a pleasure trip, but again, we always go to the cemetery. We do go to the Gayverovas. And then I went back. This was interesting. I made plans many, many years ago that when my children grow up, I want to take them back for them to see where they come from. And we did that 3 years ago. My husband, myself, and my 3 sons, we made the trip. We went to all the small towns where my grandparents were buried, where I lived, my grandparents lived. My husband's father was buried where he lived in Budapest. We made a trip for them to know where they come from, their heritage.
How was that?
It was, for my children, it was enlightening. For them, it was very interesting, and for me, it was sad. But it's a trip that I wanted them to. While we're still alive, I wanted them to know where they come from.
Do you think about your experiences much?
No, I really want to shut it out. Maybe my memory is not so good because of that. If I think back of the past, I cry. I don't want to cry.
Do you ever talk about your experiences with people?
Not really, no. Again, it has to do with the fact that I claim I don't remember much, so there's not much to talk about. And there are so many people who have more horrendous stories to tell. I don't feel my story is that horrendous. I survived.
Did your relationship with God change at all because of your experiences?
Let me tell you this. I was a child, so I don't remember much about how I felt about religion in those days. Do I question? Yes, I do. I can. I am Orthodox today. I keep all the laws, but I do question. I don't know anybody in their right mind cannot question. You have to question. Why? So, in a way, it's a cop-out, what I'm doing by shutting it all out. But that's the way I can survive. We all have to survive the best way we can. Why did my brother die in Auschwitz? Why did my brother survive Auschwitz and get killed in the United States? There's no answer for that. So, you put it behind you. And you live for the day.
Do you ever have any dreams?
Yes. I do have sometimes dreams about Nazis, Germany, running, being frightened. It's interesting. I do have it. But I don't want to dwell on it.
Do you feel your life turned out differently because of your experiences?
Of course. I mean...
The type of person you are?
Yes. Yes, I think it did. Why? Because of the many questions. Because I don't believe everything blindly. And because I believe very much in living for today. I don't know what tomorrow is going to bring. You wouldn't have thought in 1943 what you're going to go through in 1944. I don't believe much let's put it this way, I don't believe everything I hear. I don't believe somebody telling you, don't worry, everything is going to be all right. It's just not like that. It's not true. You just don't leave things to... I don't believe in fate. I don't believe that you should leave things to fate. I just don't believe it. You've got to fight for it. You've got to fight for your own survival. Saying goes, God helps those who help themselves. God will help you, but you've got to help yourself. It just doesn't happen by itself. I don't think today I could be marched to a death camp. I would fight. I'll take you with me, but I'm not going to march.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Okay, this is a picture of myself and my two sisters. From the right, my middle sister, whose name is Iboy, and then next to it is myself, and next to myself is Valerie Weiss. The picture was taken in Budapest in 1944. On the right, my sister has a scarf on her shoulder because she's covering her yellow star. This picture is myself. My name is Pearl Gross, and it was taken in Nyírbátor. This is the town we went to after the war when we left Budapest, and it was taken in 1945. I was 9 years old. It was taken in the summertime. This picture has myself, Pearl Gross, the little girl, and to my right is my sister Iboya and a friend of hers. It was taken again in Nyírbátor in 1945 in the summertime. That was after we left Budapest again. These are my parents and myself. The names are Adolf Weiss, Heinal Weiss, and Maria Weiss. And this is a passport picture. It was taken in 1947 in Hungary. It's when we left Hungary to go to Germany. This picture is of my brother, whose name was Julius Weiss. He's the one who survived Auschwitz and killed in 1953 in New York. The picture was taken in New York in front of the Yeshiva University building where he attended.
What year?
That was in 1953.
And how old was he?
He was 23 years old. And he was killed when he was 23 years old, soon after this picture was taken. This picture is of my parents. Their names were Maria and Adolf Weiss. The picture was taken in Miami Beach, and the years were in the 70s. They were on vacation. This picture was taken in 1994. It was my youngest son's wedding. In the back row, from right to left, my brother-in-law, Ernest Bleich, husband of Iboya, my brother, Tibby Weiss. His wife next to him is Judith Weiss. Next to her, my son Robert and his wife Abigail. Next to Abigail, my brother Myron. And next to Myron, my brother-in-law Alex, the husband of Valerie. The front row, from right to left, Blanche Weiss, the wife of Myron, Valerie Weiss, my oldest sister, the wife of Alex, myself, my husband Jack Rose, and my sister Iboya Bleich. And this was taken in New York.
Thank you.
Oh, what else to say?